and we will go for approximately 1 hour. I'm joined by a group of people who are helping me up in a different room to moderate the session. And I also have with me in the background, Juliette Benequisto, our SFT union president. I'm really happy to be working and partnering with the SFT and other groups across the organization. I'm going to start off today by providing an overview to our plan. And then after the overview of our plan, we'll open it up for some questions and answers. Anything that we don't answer, we'll make sure that we provide also as a part of a published Q&A. And I'd love to be able to have ongoing dialogues like this too. This is a summary of the plan, so just a synopsis. The full plan is posted on our website. I would also mention too that of course any updates are also posted on our website. That's a place we could go to regularly to find any kind of updates in addition to what I send out on a regular basis. So again, good morning, everyone. I'm Aaron Bochniak. I'm the interim superintendent of Schenectady City Schools, and I'm going to lead you through an overview of our process and our timeline for today's plan. So we launched 2 surveys on July 10th. We also, after that, conducted focus groups for about 10 different focus groups between July 13th and the 22nd. We were really lucky to have a core team of people analyze those survey results and help put together the plan that we have in place. One of the things that I would mention, the core team is cross-representative of folks across the district, but the input to the plan came from all internal and external stakeholders. So in total, we got 2,320 survey responses, 1,500 or so from families, another 750 from staff. And we also had 273 participants, internal and external stakeholders in our focus groups. And the federal and state and local guidelines were put together with that information to help develop what our plan would look like. So I asked for, as we went through the idea in developing our plan, that we needed to have some non-negotiables. And so the things that guided our plan was that learning was going to follow a daily schedule. We're still subject to a 180-day calendar, that our first day of instruction is Tuesday, September 8th. And I think if you're following along in the news, you'll see that we've postponed that now to September 14th to front load our superintendent's conference days as training opportunities for staff. That is still pending, of course, approval from the Board of Education at their next meeting this coming Wednesday. Daily and class period attendance would be required. We know that our curriculum and teaching is going to have to be spiral in nature. We wanted to make sure that there was a choice and that we would ask parents to commit to that choice for their kids for at least a 10-week period. And that at some point, any of our classes, whether they're in person as a part of the hybrid model or virtual or virtual academy, all courses could at some point be 100% virtual. We also asked for everyone's flexibility, and I'm going to ask for your flexibility as we go through this too, because many of the items, as you can imagine, we're kind of standing this up as we go. This is the first time any of us have had to reopen a school amidst a pandemic, so we're trying to make sure, rather than operate and get things in place quickly, that we're doing it with the kind of planning that's required for being able to do this. And as such, there might be times too where we either don't have the answer and we'll work quickly to get it for you, but likewise, even as we start to implement the plan, there's going to be times where we might have to change. And so I know all of us like to know what the plan is going to be, but there are times too where we know we might have to change course amidst the year. We also created the plan based on a focus on equity, culturally responsive education, and anti-racism. That was a part of our plan as we went through in the planning of our plan. The major components of the plan that I'm going to outline for you are these components, and I'll make sure as we go through each of them to spend a little bit of time on each one. And when we're all done, I will be opening it up for a question and answer. So if you bear with me for just a second, I'm going to stop my share, and I have a new presentation I'm going to share with you. Bear with me for just a moment. And one of the reasons why I wanted to share a different presentation is because I had a different version of the presentation that I was using to have a conversation with some others. And I wasn't taking into account some of the things that we need to know for our Zoom piece. So because we're utilizing Zoom, we are going to record the session. I know I mentioned that, but I wanted to also, as a part of our live session, mention too that we are going to be recording. So I will ask that it be recorded starting now. And that's so that we also have the opportunity for playing back the session at any point for also those who might not be able to make it. When I'm done with the overview, you'll also have the opportunity to use the Q&A function within Zoom. So there's a button in Zoom for Q&A. It'll pop up with a screen that gives you the ability to type in a question. That's how we'll have the ability to have questions, and a moderator who are helping me will come on screen to ask questions. As they're being answered, we'll also provide answers to questions in the chat function, the Q&A function, in addition to publishing them afterward. So some of these pieces, as I mentioned, we've gone through. So I'm going to jump us back to where we were before. Bear with me as I get caught up. So this is where we left off, our major components, and I'm going to jump right into student choice. And I mentioned before that we knew that going through the focus groups, the choice was important to our parents. And so when we developed our plan, we were offering a choice for a hybrid version or a completely virtual version. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what each of those schedules might look like as we delve in. In order for any of this to be successful, we know our partnerships with families and community is going to be extremely important. So as we even continue to evolve our plans, we'll want to maintain those connections with families and community. And you'll notice in our planning, even as we go and delve deeper into our plan, we'll continue to engage stakeholders in that process. The plan was developed using the health and safety recommendations based on the guidance from the Center for Disease Control, the New York State Department of Health, the State Education Department. We have a strong partnership with the health, safety, and risk folks at Capital Region BOCES. And then also along the way and on a weekly basis, we've been meeting with the Schenectady County Department of Public Health, and they've also been strong partners in this process. So for the health and safety component, health checks are going to be conducted in screenings of all students and staff each and every day. So as students and staff are entering a building, they will have their temperature taken and they will be screened prior to coming into the building and going to their classroom. The same would apply for any visitors, contractors, and vendors. I would make note too that we're really, for the most part, closing off our buildings to people from the outside coming in unless there's some sort of an emergency need for them to be here, or it's a contractor that's working here on a regular basis. But otherwise, outside groups we would not have coming into the building. We would require social distancing of at least 6 feet or more, depending on what the activity is. It might be larger than a 6 feet distance. It might be 12 feet or more in cases of either perhaps special education, band, orchestra, or other types of classes that would require a larger than 6 feet social distancing. We would require face coverings too. Face coverings are needed to be worn at all times by staff and students would only be able to remove their PPE at the direction of an adult. We know that there's some questions also about how we'll enforce that. We are working on an addendum to our code of conduct that will ask parents and students to sign with an understanding that it is for the health and safety that we're requiring this, and only in those rare instances in which a 504 is given to a student would we come up with an alternative accommodation to a face covering. We'll be following all infection control strategies. I mentioned plumbing here and ventilation. I'm going to get into that a little bit more as we get into the facilities piece of this, and then also management of ill persons, contact tracing, monitoring, and COVID testing. And likewise, each of them I'm going to delve into just a little bit more. But to get into the piece around COVID testing and contact tracing, I know there's been some confusion or question even around, will the school conduct any COVID testing? And the answer is no, we will not conduct COVID testing. However, in the event that there is an assumed positive case or someone presents with symptoms, the district would indeed be referring them either to their primary care physician, an urgent care, or the Schenectady County Department of Public Health as our partners in this process to have the person put in touch with a testing center and directed for testing. Likewise, if a test were to come back positive, we would partner also with the Schenectady County Department of Public Health to conduct contact tracing. So there will be protocols in place that we'll review during our first PD days with staff around the flow around a building. And you'll know as we start going through this that the limit of people going around the building will be actually quite high. We don't anticipate there being a lot of movement around the building, but when there are times in which students or staff have to move from room to room, we'll have a process in place in which that can be tracked, so that in the eventuality that there is a positive case, we have the ability to turn over that contact tracing immediately to the Department of Public Health. So in our facilities, and I mentioned I would touch on some of these pieces a little bit more, there will be an increased level of cleaning and disinfecting. One of the reasons for us moving to the hybrid schedule for in-person education is to allow for that to happen on a daily basis. We are also increasing ventilation wherever there is a mechanical ventilation system. We would have a minimum of 25% fresh air intake. And then also any classes that are not in a building with mechanical ventilation, which is the most of our classrooms, we would only be placing exterior classrooms with windows that open in order to allow for that ventilation to take place. Social distancing will be required. Water fountains will be at a minimum, the minimum to allow for a sufficient amount of water to be available for students, but also to prevent numerous water fountains from being used and to allow us to clean only those that are being used on a regular basis. You might also notice in coming back that some toilet stalls are closed off, and that's also to allow for more frequent cleaning and also for social distancing in our restrooms. We are still required to do fire drills and lockdown drills, but they will be modified as we go into the school year because we'll need to do them in a socially distant way. So we'll be working with you a little bit more during the start of school and what that would look like. And then there's an increased amount of signage around our buildings. When you enter our buildings, notice, of course, the signs that you're probably used to seeing when you come into any kind of public space about the importance of wearing a mask properly, washing hands, but also some additional signage on our floors, even the directions that you should be walking as you're walking through the hallways and what side of the hallway you should be walking on, or how far away you might need to stand from a desk in order to be socially distant. As far as child nutrition goes, one of the ideas behind our hybrid model for in-person learning is the fact that as a result of doing that, we do not have to have meals in our classrooms. And hence, that's one less item we have to worry about, that increased risk of sharing of food and also exposing ourselves to practices that could potentially be unhealthy. We will be sending kids home each day, however, with their lunch for that day and their breakfast for the next morning. Any students who are participating in the virtual academy will also have the opportunity to have access to lunches and breakfast for the next day, and they'd have to go to a site that we have around the city. There'll be multiple of them in order to be able to get their lunch for that day and their breakfast for the next day. Transportation, we know, is an essential piece of getting kids to school. Whenever possible, we are encouraging families and have asked them who will be dropping off their kids versus those who will be needing transportation. If they're still in need of transportation, we'll be reducing the capacity to 50% or less. In most cases, it'll be around 33%, but no more than 50%. Our routing will look different too. We're looking to do routing by class and building. And in addition, face coverings will be required on the bus at all time. Window hatches would be open as well in order to allow for ventilation, as long as the temperatures remain at least 45 degrees or higher. There will be seating charts as well. So we'll be assigning students to seats in order to allow for facial coverings and also loading and unloading plans. So the seating charts is the area in which it allows us to maybe expand beyond the 33% up to a 50% capacity, because there could be situations where we have families who are coming and traveling to school together, and we would be able to then seat them together, and in that regard have an increased capacity on the bus while still allowing for social distancing between families and other students. So a sample school schedule between pre-K and our elementary grades. One of the things I would mention to you too, initially we had explored some options of maybe needing to move some grades to some other buildings. That's still always a possibility, but based on our initial numbers, it's not looking like that would have to be the case, meaning that each class that would come for the hybrid in-person model would most likely be taking place in the building for which it was assigned, and more to come as we evolve and work on that and refine our information around it. But as you can see, students would be dismissed between 11:45 and noon, and then they would finish their day out virtually as they travel home to finish out their day. So there would still be a virtual component to the day, but core instruction would happen in the morning. And then likewise at the secondary level for both the middle schools and the high school, we would be looking to do dismissal between 12:25 and 12:40. Students would travel home and then complete their day virtually too, with the first half of the day being dedicated to more of that core coursework. And the way that we've mapped this out is that for the virtual academy, we would be running courses whenever possible at capacity. So that means that at the elementary level, it could be 25 to 30 in a virtual academy class, 30 to 35 in a secondary virtual academy class. All classes in the virtual academy are synchronous, as they would be in the hybrid instruction too. The only difference is for hybrid instruction, as I mentioned before, students would come in person in the morning, be in a synchronous virtual classroom for the afternoon, but those classes would be reduced in order to allow for social distancing. And the reduction would be dependent on the size of the classroom to allow for social distancing, but it's somewhere between 12 and 13 in the younger grades, perhaps up to 15 at some of the higher grades. And again, depending on the classroom, it would dictate how many students would be in the class in order to safely allow for that. So for in-person days, one of the things we proposed as a part of our initial plan, and again, we're looking at this as we start to put our student schedules together, daily English language learners, self-contained special ed classrooms, pre-K, grades K through 6 and 8, 9 would come every day. 7, 10, and 11, we looked at alternating weeks. Half of the students come on an A week. Well, they're learning in person on their A week. The B week kids are home, but learning synchronously through a virtual platform. And then grade 12, depending on the credits that that student needed, it could be either model. But now that we're seeing the numbers for this, it's possible that the 7, 10, and 11 students could perhaps also be, rather than alternating weeks, also attend daily. But I think in the next week or so, we should be able to finalize that as we hear from families. We know that childcare is an issue for our families, but also for you too. And so as a result of that, the district has also partnered with the Boys and Girls Club and the YMCA to be able to offer childcare sites across the city. It's flexible childcare in that it's before school care, also after school care, or in some cases, if you're in a district has a different schedule, they also have during the day care as well too. So if you needed child care, that you're a place where your child could also participate in some sort of virtual learning for your home district, these sites would be able to allow for that too. By the end of this week, we'll have more detailed information with who to reach out to and what the pricing would be if you're interested in contracting. And then I mentioned Brightside up there. They're formerly known as the Capital District Child Care Council. Their new name being Brightside Up. They're a great resource and network for helping put families in touch with childcare, and the payment options are generally something that can be worked out on some sort of a sliding scale. Technology and connectivity for any staff and of course students too. We'd want to make sure that devices were available. The district has ordered and has begun to receive additional Chromebooks and also MiFi devices to have ready for the start of school. With our delayed start for students coming back and instruction not starting till the 14th, we anticipate being able to also use those superintendent's conference days to deploy other non-teaching staff to hand out or swap out devices that might not be working to those who need them. So more to come on that as well, but there is a plan. So next steps, we have calculated that we have 25 working days to be able to implement our plan. That was before students came back. We've got a couple more now, about 4 more days now with our superintendent's conference days now being front loaded. We do plan to continually engage stakeholders in the process along the way. So I mentioned that I will keep, of course, our faculty and staff updated as we move through this. We launched a survey or questionnaire for families to commit to one of two options, either the hybrid or the virtual option. That was due by August 9th. We extended it for families to Wednesday and have a pretty comprehensive response at this point, and there are still people making phone calls. However, we're going to be sending out a letter confirming their choice. For those we haven't heard from, we are automatically enrolling those families into the virtual academy and giving them a number to call in case they would like to make some sort of a change. But we're also asking families, as you heard me say before, that we'd like them to lock into this for 10-week intervals. We anticipate finalizing schedules for students and teachers later in August. We're still working through and combing through the information to create schedules. And then any adjustments to the school calendar I mentioned before, we would be announcing. And I'm hoping to be able to provide something to you more affirmative once the board approves my recommendation to have the start delayed until the 14th, with our superintendent's conference days being the 8th through the 11th. So I do want to be able to open it up now to questions, of course. I will mention, of course, Let's Talk is available in case you want to be able to ask other questions as well, too. It's always available to you, and we have a team of people that are there responding to questions as we get them. But you have the Q&A feature available to you, as I mentioned, in Zoom. And because we planned an hour for this, this gives us about 40 minutes, 39 minutes to be exact, to be able to do Q&A. A moderator, in this case, Patty Pazer, will be reading the questions that's populated into the chat, and a team of people behind her will be typing the answers so we can memorialize them not only here, but in any future Q&As that we publish as well. So, Dr. Pazer, what is the first question? You're on mute. We've already said we've coined that to be the term of the year. I'm sure you've all heard that by now, but I want to get a t-shirt that says you're on mute so I can just stand up and say you're on mute. Sorry, Dr. Pacer, go ahead.
Will teachers
turn off the mic on your laptop?
Will teachers still be able to enter buildings at 6:45 a.m. to prep for the day?
Will teachers still be able to enter buildings early to prep for the day? I would say give us a little bit of time to iron those exact times out. We will have some staggered times to come in. The only reason why I'm hesitant to say yes to that immediately right now is because we'll have screening in place for staff too. So we'll want to make sure that that screening is available at a certain time in which you can enter the building in order to be able to go to your classroom. So hang on tight to that. We know people like to come in early, but we want to make sure we're staffed for that in order to be able to come in to the building.
How soon should we be applying for work from home accommodations if needed?
If you need accommodations, please check the email that I sent out to staff. I sent it out a couple different times with a link to a Q&A around accommodations and then also a form. Don't wait. If you think you need an accommodation, it's an interactive process and it does take a little bit of time to work through. I can tell you, anyone who has submitted something so far to that, through yesterday anyway, our HR staff has worked to be able to be in touch with them. So please submit something now so someone from HR can reach out and start working with you on that process.
If we apply and are approved for an accommodation and find our building can supply us with a safe workspace, can we cancel that request if it's no longer needed?
So an accommodation, that's a great question. An accommodation might not automatically necessitate you even needing to not be in the building. And if there was a space available for you to be able to be in the building and still teach safely and accommodate you in the way that your accommodation requires, then we could certainly take a look at that. That is not off the table whatsoever.
Can a classroom teacher require masks be worn at all times?
So absolutely, we're leaving it at this point too as that extension of the code of conduct that we'll be asking for them to sign that pact. And it will be only at the direction of a supervising adult that a student should be removing a mask.
Today, the Gazette had numbers of students picking virtual. Is there a report we can see where this is also done by percentage of registered students and a breakdown by school?
We actually, of course, have those numbers. If staff are interested in them, we can certainly look to make them available. We were still finalizing them, of course, as we were doing that and as the Gazette ran that, but we can certainly look to make those available. And we could even break it down to percentages by building just to give an idea of what we're talking about. But on average right now, and it said that in the article this morning, it's about 60% of families across the district, and that's pre-K through 12, seeking to be in the completely virtual school.
Will teachers be allowed to use fans in their classrooms? Some rooms are extremely hot. Would the building's fan or exhaust unit right under a window, or there's delivery trucks around windows? Sometimes people can't open their windows as much.
So I would just want to make sure the short answer is yes, but we'd want to make sure that we're working with you in such a way that the fan isn't placed in a location in which could cause additional issues with circulation or ventilation of the air. We wouldn't want to put a fan that could also promote somehow having an aerosol of some sort sprayed into the room versus out of the room. I don't see it as an issue, but we just want to work with you to make sure it's properly placed.
We are seeing reports of what is happening as schools reopen. What is our plan when a student or teacher is positive for COVID? Do we close schools? If so, what happens when our sick time runs out?
So that's a great question, and we're seeing lots of cases across the country, of course, where that's happening. Our plan locally, and we're really lucky, I think, right now, because we started off in New York State and not such a great place. But now I think some other states are looking to us as a model state, and we're not in a hot zone. And some of those cases that we're seeing are in more of those hot zones where people are going back to school. I think that we're likely to see cases too. I don't think it's a matter of if we'll see a case. I think we will see a case, and our plan would be if someone comes up and they're symptomatic or becomes symptomatic during the day, and that's whether it's a student member or a staff member, it doesn't matter. Each building has a designated isolation area where we would be bringing that person to. We would work to put them in touch, if it's a student, of course, with their family, their primary care provider, urgent care, or the Department of Health. But as far as our next steps go, that's where the Department of Health comes in. We're going to work with them because there are so many it depends along the way as to whether or not we would shut down. And some of it has to do with how long the contact was for, who it was with, where they've been, and they're going to help and direct us through that process. So it might not automatically necessitate a building being shut down, but it could be a classroom. And when it comes to mandatory quarantines and what that looks like, and that's the important part of us working through the Department of Health. They're the only ones who can mandate a quarantine, really. That comes into a case too, where the sick time that we're talking about becomes protected under a mandatory quarantine. So we'd want to really work closely with the Department of Health in that regard.
Some of our buses make multiple runs to different schools. What if a student on one of those runs becomes infected? Will this be traced so everyone who was exposed can self-isolate?
Yes, and we have detailed manifests available for each of our runs. There's an extra layer of precaution being added in too, because we'll actually be doing somewhat of an attendance on each bus. We're looking to even have staff stationed to do some pre-screening as students enter the bus too. And in addition to that, if there are times in which we do have buses doing multiple runs, which will most likely be the case, there will be a cleaning in between those runs as well.
For those who are doing the hybrid model, will we be expected to leave the building when the students are dismissed?
So for teachers who are teaching in the hybrid model, I was actually a topic of discussion with Juliet and Patty and I this morning. We're going to work out those details. Wouldn't say it's necessarily an expectation, but we'll work out what those guidelines are going to look like. This is all relatively new, so stay tuned, and in the coming days we'll be able to provide with some more specific answers.
In the future, do we have a plan for reopening fully in person?
So our reopening fully in person, we really are planning.
No, do we have a plan for it? in the future, if we were to get ready to open fully in person, is there a plan already in place?
So our plan for the start of school is certainly to have either this hybrid or completely virtual model. As we get to a place where we are able to reopen fully, perhaps a vaccine is available and we're able to reopen fully, I think for this year, we would still be committed to this plan and seeing it through. We'd have to have some drastic changes in public health change this year in order for us to change course with that. That's certainly possible. I'd want us to remain flexible with that, but we wouldn't look to do a complete or full reopen until we got into the next academic year.
There are classrooms that have windows that don't open or are difficult to open. How will you address that issue?
We are making sure that we're going through classrooms right now and that windows do indeed open. So there is visual inspections being done of each room that we would be using as classrooms to make sure that we do have windows that can open in order to allow for adequate ventilation.
In trying to understand how we are meeting virtually to discuss being face-to-face in 3 weeks, what will be different?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
We'll come back to that one.
Okay.
I'll go into the next one.
Okay.
Will we be provided with daily PPE, and what type of PPE will be provided?
So that's a great question. You're certainly available to bring your own face covering. The district will also have face coverings available for any staff who might forget them or not have something, and likewise for students. I believe we've received an order of about 400,000 face masks that could be used for either students or staff, and they're of varying sizes if they're for youth or adults. In addition to that, hand sanitizer is going to be available in multiple locations in each classroom. So those are ways in which we've provided both hand sanitizer and masks. And we would hope that, of course, students and staff are able to bring their own, but if they're unable to or forget them, or if it breaks during the day or becomes soiled for some reason, we do have those extras that can be available.
Will the professional development days be in person?
So the PD days that we're offering could very well be in person, but not like you probably remember. We won't be coming together in large groups in the auditorium in the high school. As much as I'd like to see each and every one of you, it most likely will be happening in your buildings through some sort of virtual format. So I would see that also being a hybrid type of model as well.
Will there be filling stations at water fountains so that students aren't putting their mouth on the fountain?
So not all buildings have those types of water fountains. In places where we could actually do change outs of them and we're able to do them, we did. If we're closing water fountains off in some buildings, the ones that students drink directly from would be closed off first and foremost versus those which are filling stations. So the filling stations would be the ones that we would want to be able to utilize first. However, we would want to also deploy cleaners throughout the day to have that be one of those areas that are frequently used and also frequently cleaned. But it would also, I would want to caution or urge caution in the use of any kind of a shared water fountain.
Is the 1 hour virtual teaching in the afternoon done at school or at home? Is there a time that teachers need to leave the school so they can start cleaning?
So that's a good question. And again, that's one of the things that I'll work out with Juliet and the SFT in the coming days, and we'll provide some more information around it. The idea, of course, is that we would like to be able to have the time to be able to thoroughly clean our facilities. However, I also recognize that everyone's circumstance is somewhat different. So if there was someone who needed to stay, we'd want to work with them. If there's someone who needed to go, we'd want to work with them as well too, to make sure that we could accommodate that.
What time will the buildings open for students? Will it still be 7:30 for the elementary, 8 a.m. for the middle school and high school?
So I would want to adjust that. And I think it's important that we look at adjusting it because in those times in which and I'll use the elementary as an example, if we're opening our doors at 7:30, it's often because we're able to provide some form of before school care or supervision. And usually, as you all know, that happens in some sort of large gathering space. Because we're looking to have students come in, be screened, and then go directly to their classroom, that could very well look different. So as we get closer to releasing student and teacher schedules, we'll be more specific with arrival and departure times in order to prevent the mass gathering of students.
Will teachers be required to teach in the hybrid model and the virtual academy, or is it one or the other?
There could be cases where we might work with teachers to do both, depending on what our needs are, and it could certainly also depend on if it's a course. I can think at the high school too, if we have students who need a certain course for credit for graduation, there could be occasions where there could be a little bit of both, but right now we're asking for staff who would be interested in committing to either or, but it could certainly be both as well.
According to the district plan that was sent out, special area classes will be held online. Will special area teachers be required to report in person? Will the special area classes be held on Seesaw and Google Classroom, or expected to be live streamed video classes?
So I'm going to say it's going to depend, and as principals begin to work on schedules and what they will look like as we start to get closer to the start of school, that will start to dictate what some of those answers are. And we use that as a sample schedule to show, of course, that some of those encore or special area courses would be offered virtually in the afternoon. That doesn't mean that 100% of them couldn't be also offered virtually, or some of them in person as well. It could be a mix of both. So as we finalize the schedules, I think we'll be able to provide some more answers to that.
It was mentioned that ELL students will attend school daily in the hybrid model. Is this true for L's in 10th and 11th grade, or will they also be assigned A week and B week?
So English language learners and special education students too, we did prioritize for daily learning. So we would want them to be attending regardless of their grade that they're in on a daily basis. So we would work to finalize their schedules a little bit differently rather than have them be a part of those rotating weeks.
If the school calendar is adjusted, will we be working later into June or possibly July?
So if the school calendar is adjusted, the plan would be is that we're front loading our superintendent's conference days, and days that were later slated in the school year to be superintendent's conference days would now become instructional days. So days in which students might not normally be here, they would be coming in, and hence as a result of that, we're still able to meet our 180-day requirement and not change what was initially deemed as the last day of school.
If we need to quarantine for 2 weeks because of exposure in our classroom, will we need to use our sick days, or would we be able to continue teaching virtually?
So that kind of goes akin to the question from before about a mandatory quarantine that I answered. And that's going to dictate to some extent what we can and cannot do. If the person is just quarantining but can teach virtually, we of course would want to be able to allow them to do that. That's beneficial to both of us and to our kids too. We want to be able to make sure that we're doing that. If they're sick, completely different story altogether. But if they're not and can continue to teach, we want that to happen. And rather than utilizing their time, there could be some instances, of course, though, where someone is placed, as I mentioned, into a mandatory quarantine and they're unable to work. Their sick time in those types of scenarios would be most likely protected if it's a mandatory quarantine.
Could you explain the virtual academy a bit more? Why do we have to sign up to teach there? Aren't we all teaching virtually every afternoon?
So the virtual academy is for the 60% of our students who have indicated that they want to have a 100% virtual day. So as a result of that, because we want to stand up a virtual academy, we want to assign cohorts of students together, hopefully by the buildings that they're already in, with a virtual teacher that they'll be with synchronously from morning. So while everyone else is in person doing hybrid, they would be in their virtual classroom doing synchronous learning. It also gives us the ability to, of course, for in-person learning to keep cohorts of students together as well too. So by doing that, we're keeping teams of kids together with the same adults and hopefully allow for those relationships to continue to be built that they form throughout the day. So even in those instances where kids are here in person in the morning, they will still finish out their day in the afternoon with most likely the same teacher, especially at the elementary level.
How will substitute teaching work when Google Classroom is password protected by the teachers?
So we'll have to work through some protocols around that. I know that that's a concern, but there is a way, of course, in Google Classroom to have co-teachers. So we'll have to figure out a way for substitutes as they come in to make sure that we're creating either some accounts specific for substitute teachers that we can assign as co-teachers of the classroom, but that our plans that we provide for substitute teachers also account for how we would get them access to the materials that they would need in order to be able to teach.
Access to accurate and rapid testing and timely results has been a national concern. Has Schenectady County Public Health provided information regarding provision of access to testing for community members who do not have a primary physician or ready access to urgent care?
Yes, they have, and they will work with us. So if someone doesn't have a primary care physician or access to urgent care, they would be the third person or entity that we would contact, and they would absolutely put that person in contact with a free testing site.
When will we get our tentative assignments, virtual or in person?
So the virtual or in-person assignments, we're hoping to get those wrapped up just as soon as possible. They'll be the thing that we need to do as we're finalizing student schedules. We'll be assigning staff to them. I'm hoping in the next couple of weeks we'll get that to you, but principals right now are feverishly working on that. So as we start working through them in the coming weeks, we'll begin to get that information out to you. But we appreciate your patience because there's lots of moving parts as we work through this.
What will the virtual schedule look like for students? Will they be on the computer for a 6-hour school day?
That's a great question because it is synchronous learning. It's not really that different than them being in person and learning in the classroom. It's just it's happening in a virtual environment. So we would operate on some sort of a period or block structure. And just like our teaching in person, we have to be good at also knowing when we need to provide breaks for kids too. So you would want to, as a part of your teaching and your classroom, want to make sure you're incorporating that in. But it is indeed, yes, being able to be virtual means that you're also in person or virtually attending a class that's going on live.
If you are a self-contained teacher and teaching virtually, will your roster remain the same?
If you're a self-contained teacher and teaching virtually, there is a chance that your roster could change because as we start to wade through and look at what choices parents have made, if you're teaching virtually, you might have kids in your class who their parents have opted for them to be virtual also, versus those who are coming in person to teach in person would be teaching the kids whose families would like them to have an in-person education. So there is a very good chance that rosters would change. And what we would want to do, of course, is to, for the most part, we want to be able to keep them as much as wholly possible as we can, just because we know that that's the best for our students and it's best for our teachers too. So whenever possible, we want to keep those connections together.
Will 6th grade teachers be teaching all core subjects, or will students be switching classrooms still?
That's a great question too. And as we iron out the details of that schedule, we really want to minimize any students transitioning between classrooms. So as a result of that, it very well might be teachers switching rooms rather than kids switching rooms. I know that looks very different than what we're normally accustomed to. And I wish I said this as a part of my flexibility slide as I went through it, but that's one of those things too. Part of our flexibility as we come back to school is that what we come back to is going to be a new version of school, something that none of us have really seen before. We're creating the pandemic version of school. And it doesn't matter whether you're coming in person or virtual, either way, it's going to look very different than it did before. I would also say too, if what you're thinking the virtual school might look like is akin to what we did after our March closure for the remainder of last school year, that we should dispel ourselves of any notion that it's going to look that way, because this is a brand new way of us looking at a synchronous learning model. So either one, hybrid or virtual, is going to look very different. And either way, it's an attempt also for our hybrid model to keep cohorts of kids together as much as possible with minimal movement throughout the building.
When will we be able to get into our classrooms to prepare?
So principals will be reaching out to teachers to start scheduling times for that. We want to make sure that things have been done and are in place in order to ready and allow for that. So stay tuned. Principals will be reaching out and working with teachers and scheduling specific dates and times. We're trying to do that on an appointment or scheduled basis, because even though we're not open right now for students or others to come into our building, we still have to do the same level of contact tracing and prevent the number of people coming into our building at one time. So bear with us, we ask for your patience, but we'll be in touch and be able to schedule specific times for you to come in.
What is the technology plan for synchronous learning?
So technology for the synchronous learning, we have platforms that we used before. I think in a previous question, someone mentioned Seesaw for younger grades, Google Classroom for older grades. Those technologies would still be available to teach in. In addition to that, anyone who needed a device or access to internet, the district has supplies of those available to make available to either teachers or students.
Will students be expected to bring their Chromebooks to school with them every day so we can get them comfortable with using them as a normal part of their learning experience?
I think that's a great question, and I would want to leave that to some extent up to each teacher and how they wanted to handle that. They know their kids best, they work with them best, and if they think it's something that they want to also incorporate to their in-person learning with kids, by all means. It also allows, of course, for a different type of collaboration to happen while everyone's in the same room and socially distanced. So it is possible to do that. But if there's also concern over the carrying to and from home and them getting back and forth safely, I'd want you to take that into account as a part of your classroom plan.
When can teachers begin making duplicating requests?
Teachers could begin making duplicating requests right now. There's no reason why they couldn't start doing that even through building secretaries and making sure that those get in, especially if you have things that you know, materials you know that you're going to use. The only thing I would ask you to do though is perhaps wait until you know what your final roster counts are, because if in the past you were making enough for 25 or 30 students and you're teaching in person, it could certainly be far less than that. So in order not to do a waste of paper and printing, I think those numbers would be helpful for us to know.
If a family realizes that they have been placed in the virtual academy because they didn't respond and now wants in-person schooling, is the district going to allow last-minute changes of scheduling?
So we are going to be telling those families that we automatically placed into the virtual academy that if it's creating some sort of a hardship or emergency situation for them, that we would want to work with them, but it's going to be dependent on space. And what I mean by that is that we want to keep our class sizes as minimal as possible to allow for social distancing. But if a classroom did have room in it because there was an empty desk in the classroom that was already socially distanced and we were able to accommodate that, we would. In cases though, however, where it would require us to open up an additional section because we don't have the space, we would most likely not do that. So it's going to depend on each situation.
How do you envision all of the K-5 students taking a bathroom break at the same exact time, or is that a suggested schedule?
That is a suggested schedule. Yeah, it's just a sample schedule. And within each building, we'd have to work out some sort of a schedule for how those breaks might work, because of course it would be difficult for everyone in the entire building to be doing it at the same time. But I know we don't normally schedule bathroom breaks, but for this year, that will be a necessary part of our reality.
For those that are performing health screenings, what level of enhanced protection and training are they receiving?
So we'll be developing a training for people who are doing those screenings to make sure that they have what they need in order to be able to conduct the screening safely, but also record the information that they're gathering. I don't look at this as being that different than what we're starting to see, of course, when we go to either perhaps some restaurants or stores, or even some services that you go to that are now open or have reopened. You might have a cashier or an attendant at a desk behind some sort of a partition who's still able to take a temperature and perform a screening. It's just that this would be more at each entrance as someone's coming in, and it could be in a kiosk style format. But we would provide training and supports in order to make sure that anyone who's doing that has what they need in order to remain safe.
Who will be performing the health screenings and checks for staff?
Great question, and we have to iron some of those details out. We're going to need to train staff to do it. So it doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily be a nurse or medical professional, because it's just a pre-screening in which we're taking a temperature and asking some of those health screening questions that we've become familiar with. So it could be other staff that we've trained to do that, and most likely wouldn't be a medical professional.
In terms of grading, will we be going back to our routine grading, or will we be continuing the system we established during the school closing of the spring of 2020?
That is a good question too. The grading practices that we established during our school closure last year were more so to serve the purposes of what was asynchronous learning. And as we evolve back into a more synchronous model, it might be appropriate to look back to what our past grading practices were. There could be a desire, of course, for us to continue to work to refine them given the circumstances. So I wouldn't say that they couldn't be updated or altered or slightly changed. We'd want to do that work with you, but I don't see us fully instituting that asynchronous virtual model that we did for March, April, May, and June of last year.
Will the district provide partitions for teachers' desks and tables so that they can do small group teaching?
That's a great question too. That's not something that we're automatically doing. However, if it's something that you want in your individual classroom and that's a request that you have, we would want you to be able to make that request so that we could do that. I know the district is looking at a couple different models that might be available so that we can have them and easily put them in place for anyone who might want them or need them. I would also add to some of you I know are very handy and also able to kind of do some of these things on your own. Please don't run out and try to buy plexiglass and craft something on your own or MacGyver something of your own. There are some very stringent requirements on the part of SCSD regarding the type of polycarbonate that's used. So a regular PVC that you might see in Home Depot or Lowe's wouldn't necessarily meet the muster of what's required by SCSD. So please work with us on that and we can try to find something to meet your need.
Are carts being provided and time allowed for high school teachers who are now traveling to 5 different classes as students are sitting in one room the entire day? Based on the schedule, there is no time between periods. Who will be watching the students while teachers pass?
Great question too. We would want to accommodate for that. That's a way in which we could, of course, see the use of paraprofessionals and helping with supervision in between the exchange. In any case where a teacher might or need access to a cart, we'd certainly want to make those available. Those are great requests or questions that I'd want you to be able to bring to your principal so that we can collect those and get those in place for you. But we do certainly have a stock of them, carts, and can certainly have more if needed as well.
Is there a chance that teachers will be teaching outside of their certification area?
I don't want to never say never, but our intent would be first and foremost to assign teachers within their certification. And I've heard other districts that have had to stretch that a little bit, and they've asked people to teach out of their certification areas. We're not intending to do that. There might be cases where we have no choice but to do that, but I would hope that those are exceptions and not the rule, and it's not something the district is looking to do wholesale.
I share a room with another teacher. Will we share the room in the fall, or each teacher will be allocated with a separate room?
If you're still talking, Patty, I missed the last part of what you're saying.
I share a room with another teacher. Will we share the room in the fall, or each teacher will be allocated with a separate room?
So I don't want to answer that question without knowing the specifics. It depends. I would say that would be something you'd want to work out with your principal, because every building is a little bit different. And also the circumstance in which perhaps you're sharing the room, the co-teaching model, whatever the model might be, it might depend. So there are some cases where we might be needing to break people up because of social distancing, space, and what's required for us to be able to give the best possible education for kids in the most healthy and safe way. So we could need to split people up, but it's not a blanket yes or no answer.
What is the protocol for students in personal offices? Sometimes many students at one time are dropped off in guidance or one of the principal's offices.
So in those scenarios, we wouldn't have students gathered. It doesn't mean that there might not be a waiting area where kids could come in, but they would have to be socially distanced in order to be able to be in a waiting area. So we would have markings on floors or seats marked off where kids can or cannot sit. But in those types of scenarios, we wouldn't just have groups of kids coming to guidance or the main office or to other areas of the building without having some sort of a plan in place first. And I want to mention too, just as we go through these questions, I know that there's a lot of questions. I'm going to work with Juliet to also make sure we're publishing the questions and answers from today, but any others that we weren't able to get to. I mentioned that knowing that we only have 4 minutes left, so I want to make sure in that 4 minutes we're able to answer as many questions as possible. If I didn't get to yours yet, please don't worry, we will be getting those out as well. I'm sorry, Patty, go ahead.
Will applying for teaching in the virtual academy affect our assignments for the next year?
So I'll be working with Juliet and the SFT on making sure that we can preserve assignments or rights to buildings so that what we do this year is not setting a precedent for what future years might look like. I recognize that what we're doing right now and what we're standing up right now is a matter of the circumstances that we're in. I wouldn't want that to impact anyone adversely moving forward.
Will EAP benefits apply to all Schenectady employees this school year?
Yes.
Is the district going to limit staff members' exposure by limiting how many different settings they are placed in throughout the day?
I think that's a great question too. And yes, whenever possible, just like we're talking about not having a lot of movement with kids, we'd want to do the same whenever possible with staff to the greatest extent possible. And I'm glad this question is coming up because it also makes me think about the things that each of us are responsible for needing to do in order to ensure our own safety as well. So when we think about those protections that are needing to be put into place, we want to make sure that our face masks are on, that we're using the PPE in the way that it's supposed to be used, that we're washing our hands regularly, and we're maintaining a social distance from others. Those are the kinds of things that is part of our responsibility, each and every one of us, as well as our kids too. But as adults, we have that even greater responsibility to make sure not only we're doing it for ourselves, but we're also working with our kids and our families around that too.
How will related services such as PT, OT, ENL, and speech be delivered in both teaching models?
That's a great question too. And I know that each of you as trained pedagogues will work really hard to modify things to the best of your ability. It's our goal, of course, that we're going to be able to accommodate what's written into a goal and an IEP to the fullest extent possible, with, of course, that understanding if it needs to be modified in any way, that we would work to modify it out of a necessity for health and safety. But I know that that's going to put a strain on all of us as either related service providers or teachers to be able to deliver it to the fullest extent possible. But I also trust in our ability to be able to modify when necessary.
How will science labs and space be handled?
So each of those would be handled on a scheduled basis. In a situation of a science lab or any other type of lab type of experience where we have students coming together, we would have to modify the lessons that we're doing in those type of environments in order to ensure that we've got that ongoing physical distancing and spacing required. If it's something that's going on that requires an even larger social distancing, and I mentioned the example of like band or chorus, orchestra or chorus, there could be even a greater distance that's required. It could be 12 feet or more. So we are at 12:30, and I'll take one more question, Patty, and then we'll close for now. So what is the last question that we've got?
Will the district be informing parents of the expectations of students who are participating in virtual learning?
Yes, everyone who participates either in the hybrid model or the virtual model will receive some sort of set of expectations, and it might look a little bit different for each one. The hybrid model, of course, is going to be around the proper use of PPE and the requirement around that. For the virtual model, it's around attendance and the requirement around attendance and what that synchronous model would look like. But we do anticipate providing those to each and every person so that they have them and understand what the expectations are. But I'm certainly going to need every one of your help in supporting that too, especially as we work with families and students to understand what those expectations are going to look like. I apologize that we've run out of time, but I do want to thank you for participating. I mentioned before, this is really evolving. It's to the point where really almost on an hourly basis, there are things that are changing and evolving, and it's going to probably continue like that right through the start of school. So I really appreciate your flexibility, your understanding, your cooperation, and your ingenuity to make all of this work. I'm really proud of all of you and your ability to be so adaptable to this. And I know that it isn't going to be any easier going into this next school year. It's just such an unprecedented time, but we're here for you and we'll work with you to the greatest extent possible. We'll look to have additional Q&A forums if people think these are helpful and would want to have more of them to be able to ask these kinds of questions as we get close to the start of school. I'd be glad to do that. I think the closer we get to the start of school, the more likely we are to have more concrete answers in some places too. Knowing that some of these things are evolving on a daily basis, I'll work closely with Juliet and try to find times at which it might be beneficial for us to do more of these sessions. In the meantime, I hope you all have a great day. I appreciate you joining, and we will be posting the recording of this session in case you weren't able to make it or if you want to rewatch along with Q&A. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. I appreciate your time. Bye-bye.